Keanu Reeves had always been different from most Hollywood stars. While many of his fellow actors enjoyed living in luxury, showing off expensive cars, and throwing loud parties, Keanu preferred a much simpler way of life. He was one of the most famous men on the planet, but if anyone saw him on the streets of Los Angeles, they might mistake him for an ordinary person. He often dressed in plain clothes, sometimes riding the subway, sometimes sitting quietly in a coffee shop with a book in his hands. People who passed him were always surprised by how humble he seemed. That evening was no different. The sun was setting in Los Angeles, painting the sky with warm shades of orange and pink. Keanu had finished a quiet day of meetings and was now walking down the street near his neighborhood. He had no bodyguards surrounding him, no fancy cars waiting by the corner. Instead, he carried himself just like a regular man, with his hands in his pockets and a soft, thoughtful expression on his face. The people around him knew who he was, of course. It was impossible not to recognize the man who had played Neo in The Matrix and John Wick in the action films that had made him a global legend. Some fans gave him a shy wave or smiled as they walked by. Keanu, in his usual gentle way, would return their smiles or nod politely. For him, kindness cost nothing. As he walked, a group of young fans spotted him and asked for pictures. Without hesitation, Keanu agreed. He stood with them, smiled warmly, and even cracked a light joke that made everyone laugh. These small gestures were not rare for him. He treated every stranger with respect, as if fame had never touched his life. People who met him often said, "He's not like other celebrities. He's one of us." The street was quiet that evening. Cars passed by, their headlights beginning to glow as darkness slowly settled in. The air was cool, and the smell of nearby food trucks filled the area. Keanu paused for a moment to look at the sky. He often found peace in small things, like watching a sunset or listening to the wind. In a world that constantly demanded noise and attention, he valued silence. But as calm as everything seemed, life often has unexpected turns waiting at the corner. What Keanu didn't know was that within a few minutes, his peaceful walk would be interrupted in a way that no one could have imagined. The same man who was admired worldwide for his quiet dignity would suddenly be at the center of a scene that would shock everyone present. As he continued walking, a police car slowly turned onto the street. Its flashing lights were off, but its presence immediately drew attention. Some people looked up curiously, wondering why officers had entered such a calm neighborhood. Keanu barely noticed it at first. To him, it was just another car passing by. But within moments, the car stopped, and two uniformed officers stepped out. They looked serious as they approached. People nearby paused, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Keanu stopped walking and turned toward them politely, expecting perhaps a casual question or a routine matter. But instead of greeting him with words, one of the officers quickly asked him to place his hands where they could see them. Confused but calm, Keanu complied. He had nothing to hide, and he believed that misunderstandings could always be cleared with patience. Yet, before anyone could fully understand what was happening, the officers moved closer and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. In front of shocked pedestrians and stunned fans, they began to handcuff Keanu Reeves. Gasps filled the street. A woman dropped her shopping bag in surprise, and a man pulled out his phone to start recording. The sight was almost unbelievable. Keanu Reeves, the man who was loved for his movies and his humility, standing silently as two officers restrained him. Keanu himself remained incredibly calm. His face showed no anger, no resistance. Instead, he looked at the officers with quiet eyes, as if he understood that losing his temper would only make things worse. His natural instinct was to stay composed, no matter how unfair the situation seemed. That was who he was. The entire moment unfolded in silence, except for the metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists. People whispered to one another. Some were asking, "Why are they arresting him?" Others shouted, "That's Keanu Reeves. He didn't do anything." But the officers gave no explanation. They simply guided him toward the side of the street. The atmosphere changed instantly. What had been a peaceful evening now felt heavy with tension. Fans were torn between disbelief and outrage. How could someone like Keanu Reeves, who had never been in trouble, suddenly be treated this way? Phones captured every second, ensuring that the world would soon know about it. Keanu, still calm, stood quietly with his hands behind his back. His posture was not one of a criminal, but of a man who trusted that the truth would eventually come out. The light of the street lamps shone on his face, highlighting both the unfairness of the scene and the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. For the next few minutes, nothing else seemed to matter. The city noises faded. The only focus was on Keanu and the two officers. The crowd grew larger as more people gathered, drawn by the strange sight. Conversations buzzed in confusion and disbelief. Nobody could understand what reason the police had for such an action. This was the moment where calmness and storm collided. Keanu had started his evening in peace, walking like any other man in the city. But within seconds, he became the center of a scene that would not only shock bystanders but also ripple across the world once the videos reached social media. What made the situation even more unforgettable was the way Keanu chose to react. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand special treatment. He didn't even remind the officers of who he was. Instead, he allowed the moment to play out, trusting that the truth would reveal itself in time. And yet, little did anyone know, those 7 minutes in handcuffs would not only test Keanu's patience but also destroy the careers of those who had acted against him so carelessly. The calm before the storm had ended. The storm itself was about to begin. The air on the street had grown heavy with confusion. People who had been walking home from work, shopping, or simply enjoying the evening now stood frozen in disbelief. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the scene before them. Keanu Reeves, one of the most respected men in Hollywood, was standing with his hands behind his back, locked in cold metal handcuffs. The two police officers looked tense as they held him. Their faces were serious, almost too serious for the calm neighborhood they were in. Keanu's tall figure stood quietly between them, his head slightly lowered, not because of shame, but because of his nature. He was a man who had never liked drama, never liked making situations bigger than they needed to be. Still, this was different. Even people who did not recognize him at first were whispering questions. "Why is he being arrested?" one man asked, pulling his child closer. "Did he do something wrong?" another woman wondered aloud. But those who knew him, those who had seen his films or heard stories of his kindness, were certain that something was wrong here. One young fan who had just taken a photo with Keanu minutes earlier stood frozen with her phone in her hand. She couldn't believe how quickly the evening had changed. A few moments ago, she had been smiling with her idol. Now she was watching him being led away by strangers in uniform. She started recording, her hands shaking, knowing that this was something the world needed to see. Keanu, meanwhile, said nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't demand answers. Instead, he stood silently, allowing the officers to do what they thought was their duty. His calmness surprised even the bystanders. Most people in his position would have shouted or resisted. But Keanu's face remained steady, his eyes thoughtful, as if he was waiting for the storm to pass. The officers checked his pockets briefly, searching for something. One of them muttered to the other, too quietly for the crowd to hear. But their actions spoke louder than words. It was clear that they believed Keanu was connected to something serious. Yet their body language also showed hesitation, as though even they realized the situation was unusual. The tension in the air thickened. Cars slowed down as drivers noticed the commotion. Some rolled down their windows to ask what was happening, and others simply pulled out their phones to record the moment. Within minutes, several videos were already being uploaded online, spreading faster than anyone could imagine. One man in the crowd called out, "That's Keanu Reeves. You've got the wrong person." His voice was full of frustration. A few others nodded and repeated the same words, but the officers ignored them. They stayed focused, guiding Keanu toward their car. Keanu himself spoke for the first time. His voice was calm, steady, and polite. "May I ask what this is about?" he said softly. The crowd went silent, waiting for the answer. But the officers didn't provide one. They simply told him to remain quiet and keep moving. The silence from the authorities only made the situation look worse. People's whispers turned into louder conversations. "This is unbelievable," said a woman standing near the curb. "He's one of the kindest people alive. What could he possibly have done?" Others shook their heads, muttering that it had to be a mistake. Keanu continued walking slowly with the officers. His steps were steady, not rushed, not resistant. He carried himself with dignity, even though his hands were bound. For the crowd, this made the moment even more powerful. They weren't just watching a celebrity being taken away. They were witnessing how a man handled injustice with complete calmness. A boy who was standing on the sidewalk tugged at his father's hand. "Dad, why are they arresting John Wick?" he asked innocently. The father didn't know what to say. All he could do was shake his head and reply, "Sometimes the world makes mistakes, son." As Keanu reached the side of the police car, the flashing lights suddenly came on. Red and blue colors lit up the entire street, making the moment feel even more dramatic. The sound of the siren briefly cut through the air, startling the crowd. People stepped back, some shouting, others calling out in protest. But Keanu's expression didn't change. He looked up at the sky for a moment, almost as if reminding himself that storms pass, no matter how heavy they seem. His calmness created a strange effect. While the officers appeared tense and uncomfortable, Keanu looked composed, almost at peace. The officers tried to place him into the back of the car, but the crowd's growing energy made them hesitate. Too many eyes were watching. Too many phones were recording. One officer looked nervous, glancing at the people around them. He knew that whatever was happening was no longer just a small mistake. It was becoming a public scene, one that would be seen around the world. A man shouted again, "He hasn't done anything. This is wrong." Another woman yelled, "You're going to regret this." The pressure was building. Every second that Keanu stood there in handcuffs, the anger in the crowd grew stronger. Keanu, however, turned his head slightly toward the voices. With a small, almost invisible smile, he shook his head gently as if to say, "Don't worry. Let it be." His reaction calmed some of the people, though it only made others more outraged on his behalf. For the next few minutes, the standoff continued. Keanu stood silently by the car, the officers trying to maintain control, and the crowd buzzing with disbelief. No one knew yet what mistake had led to this moment. But everyone could feel that something about it was wrong. The officers spoke quietly to each other again, clearly unsure about how to proceed. Their hesitation was obvious. The pressure of the cameras, the crowd, and the realization of who they were holding was beginning to weigh heavily on them. Still, the scene carried on. Keanu remained handcuffed, his dignity intact, while the world around him grew louder and more chaotic. In those minutes, the man who had played countless heroes on screen was showing the world what true strength looked like, not through violence or power, but through patience, humility, and calmness in the face of unfair treatment. The incident that began with flashing lights and sudden handcuffs was no longer just a small neighborhood confusion. It was about to become a story that reached millions, shaking public trust and putting certain careers in danger. And all of it was happening because of a few minutes, a misunderstanding, and a man who refused to let anger control him. The next part of the story would reveal why this had happened at all. But for now, the image of Keanu Reeves in handcuffs was burned into the minds of everyone present, and soon, it would be burned into the screens of millions across the world. The night had grown darker, but the street was brighter than ever because of flashing lights, phone cameras, and the restless energy of the crowd. Keanu Reeves stood silently beside the police car, his hands still cuffed, his face calm yet thoughtful. For him, it was just another challenge life had unexpectedly placed in his way. For everyone else, it was shocking beyond words. Nobody could understand what was happening. The man who was admired for his generosity, who gave away millions to charities, who quietly helped strangers on the subway, why would anyone suspect him of wrongdoing? To those watching, it simply made no sense. Yet the officers remained firm. They had stopped listening to the voices in the crowd. They were not arresting just any man, they were arresting someone who represented kindness to millions of people. Every passing second increased the tension, but also raised a bigger question: what had led them to this? The truth was stranger than anyone in that moment realized. Earlier that evening, the police department had received a call. A tip had come in about a tall man in dark clothing who matched the description of someone involved in suspicious activity. The caller claimed that this man was walking through the same neighborhood Keanu was strolling in. The description was vague, but the urgency in the caller's voice had convinced the officers to respond quickly. The truth, however, was that the call was false. Whether it was a prank, a deliberate setup, or a simple mistake, no one knew yet. But it had set in motion a chain of events that would embarrass the police, damage reputations, and prove just how dangerous misinformation could be. When the officers first spotted Keanu walking quietly on the sidewalk, his tall frame and simple clothing matched the rough description they had been given. Without confirming further details, without stopping to question properly, they jumped into action. In their eyes, they were doing their job, acting fast before the suspect could slip away. But now, with dozens of people watching and recording, their mistake was becoming painfully clear. Some officers might have realized it already, but admitting it on the spot was not so easy. To acknowledge the error meant admitting they had handcuffed one of the most respected men alive based on nothing more than a false tip. As the crowd grew larger, conversations turned louder. "This is unbelievable," someone muttered. "How can they not see who he is?" Others pulled out their phones to search his name, showing officers pictures of Keanu to prove it was really him. But Keanu did not try to defend himself with his fame. He didn't shout, "I'm Keanu Reeves," or demand special treatment. Instead, he continued standing silently, waiting for the officers to come to their senses. That patience, that quiet belief that the truth would eventually rise, was the very quality that set him apart from so many others. Meanwhile, social media was already exploding. The first videos uploaded from the scene had begun to spread within minutes. Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook lit up with comments like, "Why is Keanu Reeves being arrested?" and "This has to be a mistake." The world was beginning to watch in real time. Inside the police car, one of the officers received a call on his radio. The voice on the other end gave an update: new information had arrived that cast doubt on the original tip. Another team had investigated and realized the description didn't fully match Keanu after all. The so-called suspect was nowhere near this neighborhood. The officers froze. They looked at each other, uneasy. Their training had told them to act fast, but now it seemed they had acted too fast on the wrong person. And not just any wrong person, but Keanu Reeves, a global figure. The younger officer whispered nervously, "I think we've made a mistake." His partner glanced at the crowd, at the phone's recording, and then at Keanu. The weight of the situation was sinking in. They hadn't just cuffed an innocent man, they had cuffed someone whose calmness and dignity would expose their error to the world. Still, Keanu said nothing. He gave them no anger to defend against, no shouting to justify their actions. His silence was, in a way, more powerful than any words. It forced the officers to confront their mistake without distraction. The crowd, however, had no silence. They were demanding answers, demanding explanations. People shouted for justice, others pleaded for the officers to release him immediately. Some even began calling news stations, eager to share what they were witnessing live. Finally, one officer stepped forward. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "We need to verify some details," he said, speaking more to his partner than to anyone else. It was his way of admitting, without fully admitting, that things were not as they seemed. Keanu looked at him calmly, his eyes soft but steady. He gave a small nod, as if encouraging the man to do the right thing. A few minutes later, the confirmation came through on the radio again, clear and final this time. The person they had been looking for was already identified elsewhere. The tip that had brought them here had been completely wrong. And just like that, the truth was out. The entire arrest had been a mistake. The officers unlocked the handcuffs, their hands almost trembling as they did so. The metallic click of the cuffs opening was met with a cheer from the crowd. People clapped, some shouted with relief, and others simply sighed, grateful that the absurd scene was finally ending. Keanu rubbed his wrists lightly, not out of anger but simply because the cuffs had been tight. He looked at the officers, and instead of blaming them, he gave them a polite nod. No harsh words, no accusations, just quiet forgiveness. That simple gesture was more powerful than any protest could have been. The truth had unfolded in front of everyone. Keanu Reeves was innocent, as he had always been. The mistake belonged to those who acted too quickly, those who believed a false story without checking carefully. And because the world had seen everything, the consequences for those responsible were only just beginning. In the days that followed, investigations would uncover more details about the false tip and the officers' decisions. Careers would hang in the balance, reputations would be damaged, and lessons would be learned the hard way. But on that night, what mattered most was the image left behind, the picture of Keanu Reeves, standing calmly in handcuffs, showing dignity in the face of injustice, and walking away quietly once the truth had set him free. The news traveled faster than anyone could have imagined. Within hours, the videos of Keanu Reeves in handcuffs were everywhere. People on social media shared them again and again, each post filled with disbelief and anger. Hashtags started trending almost instantly, millions of people demanding answers about why such a respected man had been treated that way. At first, the clips showed only the shocking image, Keanu standing quietly as police officers cuffed him. For many viewers, that was enough to spark outrage. But as more videos surfaced, showing his calm reaction and the officers' hesitation, the story became even bigger. People weren't just upset about the arrest, they were deeply moved by the way Keanu had handled himself. One video, only 7 minutes long, showed the entire scene from start to finish. It captured the officers approaching, the crowd shouting in confusion, and Keanu remaining calm throughout. By morning, that video had millions of views. News channels picked it up, replaying it on their broadcasts, calling it the handcuff incident. Across the internet, people were writing the same thing: how could this happen? Some were angry at the officers for acting without checking facts. Others blamed the false tip that had started everything. But almost everyone agreed on one point: Keanu Reeves had done nothing wrong. The backlash wasn't limited to fans. Journalists, actors, and even public figures joined the conversation. One famous actor tweeted, "Keanu is the kindest man I've ever met. To see him treated like this is shameful." Another wrote, "If Keanu Reeves can be handcuffed without reason, what hope is there for ordinary people?" Those words spread widely, turning the story into more than just a mistake. It became a debate about fairness, justice, and accountability. For the police department, the pressure was overwhelming. Reporters surrounded their building, demanding statements. Spokespeople struggled to calm the anger, insisting that it had been a misunderstanding. But their explanations only seemed to make people angrier. "A misunderstanding?" one journalist asked during a press conference. "You handcuffed one of the most famous men alive based on a phone call. How is that acceptable?" Behind the scenes, investigations began. Officials wanted to know who had made the false call that started everything. Some believed it was a prank. Others suspected it had been done on purpose, maybe even by someone hoping to embarrass the police. Whatever the reason, it had now created a storm too big to hide. The officers involved also faced harsh criticism. Their names quickly leaked online, and within hours, people were demanding that they be punished. Videos of them standing beside Keanu, looking uncertain, were replayed endlessly. Commentators pointed out how unprofessional it seemed to act so quickly without proper evidence. Yet, in the middle of all this noise, one thing stood out: Keanu Reeves never spoke a single negative word. While the world shouted in anger on his behalf, he chose silence. He didn't give interviews, didn't post on social media, didn't demand justice for himself. Instead, he went on with his life quietly, letting others fight the battle. That silence only made people admire him more. Fans said, "Look at him, he forgave them without even saying a word." Others commented, "This is why Keanu is different. He doesn't need to shout to prove who he is." His grace under pressure became the main focus of articles, with headlines like "The calmness of Keanu Reeves shames the system" appearing in newspapers around the world. Meanwhile, the careers of those who had mishandled the situation began to crumble. One officer was placed on immediate suspension while the investigation continued. Another was reassigned, his reputation damaged permanently. The false caller, once identified, faced severe consequences for misleading the authorities. Their names became associated not with justice but with failure and embarrassment. Public trust in the police department also took a blow. Citizens questioned how easily misinformation could turn into such a serious mistake. People asked, if this could happen to Keanu Reeves, someone known worldwide, what about those who have no fame, no cameras to protect them? It was a haunting thought that spread widely, fueling even more criticism. The backlash also revealed something deeper: how much people truly respected Keanu Reeves. Fans began sharing old stories about his kindness, how he gave up his seat on the subway, how he donated money quietly to hospitals, how he once helped a stranded group of passengers when a flight was delayed. These stories, combined with the image of him standing calmly in handcuffs, created a powerful picture of a man who remained humble no matter what. News outlets around the globe picked up these stories, turning the narrative into more than just an arrest gone wrong. It became a lesson about dignity, patience, and the importance of truth. Editorials were written with titles like "The World Needs More People Like Keanu Reeves" and "Calm in the Face of Injustice." The more people talked, the more the officers' reputations sank. Their decision to act without proper evidence was now seen as reckless. One expert on law enforcement said on television, "This wasn't just about making a mistake. This was about failing to uphold the very standards of fairness they are sworn to protect." For many, the turning point was a simple clip of Keanu after being released. As he walked away from the police car, free again, he gave a small nod to the crowd. That nod seemed to say everything. It was a gesture of gratitude, reassurance, and forgiveness all at once. It spread online faster than any speech could, reminding people why they admired him in the first place. The backlash didn't fade quickly. For weeks, the story stayed alive in headlines and conversations. People used it as an example whenever discussions about justice came up. Students debated it in classrooms. Talk show hosts discussed it with audiences. Even months later, the words 7 minutes in handcuffs carried meaning far beyond the original incident. In the end, the careers that were destroyed belonged not to Keanu Reeves, but to those who had tried to restrain him without reason. The officers faced disciplinary actions, the false caller faced legal trouble, and the department itself struggled to rebuild trust. Keanu, however, walked away untouched. In fact, his reputation became even stronger. The world admired him not only for his movies but also for the way he carried himself during those 7 difficult minutes. His silence, his patience, and his calm dignity became the true story. The public backlash had done its work. The truth had been seen, and justice, in its own way, had been served. The street where it all happened slowly returned to normal after the handcuffs were removed, but the memory of that night never faded. For the people who were there, it felt like they had witnessed something they would tell for the rest of their lives. They had seen Keanu Reeves, a man known for his grace and humility, stand silently in the middle of chaos, unfairly restrained, yet never losing his dignity. As Keanu walked away from the police car that evening, he carried himself the same way he always did: calm, gentle, and without anger. The crowd cheered, but he didn't raise his hands or bask in the attention. Instead, he gave them a small nod and quietly disappeared down the street. To him, there was no need for grand gestures. His peace was his strength, and he wanted nothing more than to continue his life quietly. But for everyone else, the story was only beginning. The videos that spread online had already reached millions of people, and by the next day, the entire world was talking about it. Every major news outlet carried the headline, "Keanu Reeves wrongly handcuffed by police 7 minutes that shocked the world." Some newspapers even printed still images of him standing calmly in handcuffs, calling it one of the most powerful images of the year. For the officers involved, the consequences were swift. Their superiors launched a full investigation, and soon the truth came out. The false tip that had led to Keanu's arrest had been completely unfounded. Worse, the officers had failed to double-check before acting. In their rush, they had created not just an embarrassing mistake, but a public storm that damaged the reputation of their department. The younger officer admitted privately that he had realized too late who they had stopped. The older one confessed that the pressure of the moment had clouded his judgment. But apologies could not undo what had already happened. Their names became attached to the incident, and both faced disciplinary action. One was suspended, and the other was reassigned to a desk job. Their careers, once promising, were now overshadowed by a single mistake that lasted less than 10 minutes but was seen by the entire world. The caller who had given the false tip was also identified. Whether it had been meant as a prank or something more malicious, the result was the same: it had led to the wrongful restraint of one of the most beloved figures in Hollywood. Legal action was taken against the caller, and they quickly faded from public life, their credibility ruined. For the police department as a whole, trust was shaken. Community members questioned how something like this could happen so easily. Leaders held press conferences promising reforms, more training, and stricter checks before acting on vague tips. But the damage to their image would take years to repair. Meanwhile, Keanu's response, or rather, his lack of response, became the most powerful part of the entire story. He refused to speak negatively about the officers. When asked about it later by a journalist, he simply said, "Mistakes happen." Those 2 words carried so much weight that they were repeated across newspapers and television shows. People were stunned by how forgiving he was, how unwilling he was to fuel anger. Instead of focusing on the humiliation he faced, people focused on how he had carried himself. Memes, posts, and articles celebrated his calmness, calling it a lesson in patience and dignity. "The world could learn from Keanu," one article read. Even in the face of injustice, he chose kindness. This quiet reaction had an unexpected effect: it turned the embarrassment of the police into an even bigger contrast. While their careers fell apart, Keanu's reputation only grew stronger. He had gone through humiliation and come out looking even more admirable than before. The world saw him not just as an actor, but as a real-life example of strength without anger. Fans across the globe wrote letters and messages, saying things like, "You've shown us what it means to stay calm when life is unfair," and, "Your silence taught more than any speech could." In the months that followed, the story remained fresh in people's minds. Interviews with fans, bystanders, and experts continued to discuss those 7 minutes. Some called it a turning point for how society looked at mistakes made by people in power. Others said it proved the importance of staying calm when treated unfairly. For Keanu, however, life returned to normal. He continued riding the subway, buying coffee from local shops, and talking kindly to strangers. He never used the incident to promote himself. He never brought it up again, even when people wanted him to. His quiet choice to move forward only made the world respect him more. The officers, on the other hand, could not escape the shadow of that night. Their names became linked to the phrase "the 7-minute handcuff." No matter what they did afterward, the public remembered them as the ones who had put Keanu Reeves in handcuffs without reason. Their careers, once stable, were now fractured. One eventually resigned, unable to handle the constant criticism. The other kept working, but with a reputation that never fully healed. The false caller who started everything disappeared from headlines, but the stain on their name remained. For them, it was the end of credibility, the end of trust. A reckless act had ruined multiple lives, including their own. In the end, those 7 minutes became more than just a strange story. They became a lesson. People discussed it in schools, in offices, and in homes. They talked about how quickly a lie could spread, how dangerous it was to act without checking facts, and how true strength is shown not by anger, but by patience. Keanu himself never needed to say much. His silence spoke louder than any speech could. By refusing to fight back with bitterness, he proved that dignity is stronger than humiliation. By forgiving so easily, he reminded the world that holding on to anger only makes storms last longer. For the officers, the caller, and even the police department, those 7 minutes destroyed careers. But for Keanu Reeves, they did the opposite. They strengthened his legend, not as an action hero on screen, but as a man of character in real life. Years later, people still remember the incident. Not because of the mistake, but because of how Keanu responded. Whenever someone brings up the words 7 minutes in handcuffs, the image that comes to mind is not one of shame, but one of calm strength, a reminder that grace in difficult times can change everything.